lot of them. Okay, so would you qualify it as literature?
Yes.
Okay, so how do we know that something is literature? Can a book be something else? I don't mean, textbooks or philosophy or history books, but is every fictional story at the same time literature? It's not a trick question, but and the answer is yes, but not all literature is something that you would call valuable or valuable of your time, if you wish. So there are different approaches actually, and the old approach is usually something that persists in the school systems is that how many, okay, so the question would be how many of your reading list books you actually enjoyed reading in school?
Not many.
Why not?
For the most part, I didn't find them interesting because we did books which are from different eras, and I could not connect with them on that level.
Okay, so you could not connect with the topic or what it was about with the stories. All right.
Yes.
Okay, so why would then those books be considered valuable? What do you think?
I guess it's to show us how people lived before and how we came to become this, how we that we should learn from their mistakes and try to incorporate it with in our lives.
Okay, so somehow those fictions actually represent histories as well, and that is for one part true, because history also was a story before it became a science. But the other thing is also true. It's sometimes very difficult to find relevance of those stories in the present time. So this is reading as an enjoyable activity, so something that most of us enjoy doing. But what we will be doing here uh, will be more related to what it was like before. So the historical element of literature, but in terms of um, the approach to or the relationship of literature to language and the world around people at the time it was created, and how it reflects on present times, but also in the actual uh, artisan aspect of it, so to say. So the making of literature as a discipline. Okay, so let's go to our abstract. I have to say that this this introduction is actually the only very abstract um, discussion on literature, and later on it becomes more concrete when we talk about well, forms that are accessible or easily accessible, and that we are actually more familiar with. Okay, so how to study literature? What is our subject matter? What do we study when we study literature? So to enjoy literature is one thing, but to actually study it, you have a completely different approach. So far, you have done the whole semester of university literary studies, and I suspect you notice that it's quite different from high school approach. Yes.
Well, I think it depends on what kind of class we were in high school. Because I was in the social sciences course, and it's kind of similar to me. We had a lot of literature classes, and the difference is it was in Serbian, but kind of similar for me at least. I don't know about the others.
Okay, but um, is your focus, or okay, let me rephrase this. So the focus is not always on the topics or on the events or on the story itself. Sometimes the focus is on other elements as well. So we'll see how that works out here. But as you progress, you will discover that there are a lot of different aspects that you can dedicate your research to when you actually study literature. So different ways to study literature. So as a subject in school, it actually includes the feature or sort of a label of value. And it introduces the question who decides on that value, and how the collections of works that are represented in school curricula and in university curricula actually reflect social and cultural context. So I already mentioned yesterday that it is a question of a literary canon, and there are experts that we rely on or that we trust in their judgment. And the whole canonical study of literature actually started with the Harvard canon of writers, which was eventually challenged because although the idea of the canon actually includes works that are of a value, um, as I said yesterday, in order to stand the test of time or to become something of a value, it needs to be recognized. It Yes, sorry, that was an accident. No, okay. So to be recognized as valuable, it needs to be allowed to exist, and the reflection of social and cultural context is usually the reflection of the dominant social and cultural context. And those introduce ideological issues and the issues of social power, which usually remained in sphere of. Do you know what is the assumption who of the authors actually gets to be in the canon? What kind of authors in terms of their social position? Mm,
Those in a higher position.
okay, so they would be middle to higher position in terms of class. How about in terms of race?
Well, I think that used to be about white people more, but now it
So
changed.
how many black authors do you know?
Maya Angelou, I think. Is that her name? Sorry,
Okay,
I'm not
Maya
sure.
Angelou, yeah. Okay, so that's one. And she's also a woman, so you've got a double. You've got a double exception because what the Harvard collection of books was or used to be, it uh, was a collection of authors who were all white, who were all rich, who were all men, and who were all dead to get into the canon. So that also sort of excluded everything else. So writers of color, women, um, living authors as well. So contemporary writing wasn't something that stood the test of time. And that also opened the question whether or not we would like to or we can relate to the stories of the people who are not with us anymore. So what is it that we are studying? And so the canon actually changed eventually. And today it does include a lot of variety other than what I mentioned, the white dead males. But it still is not, since it is a question of value, it is also a question who assigns the value and how we decide on that. Literature, except for being a subject in school, it also is a business, and quite a large business at that. And sometimes it is a common assumption that value doesn't coincide with the market success. And the books that would be considered popular and the authors who sell bestsellers actually do not present the best there is in literature as art. So there is a division, or the assumed division. Sometimes it happens that artistic endeavors are also quite well received with the audience, but that's not always the case. As we can observe, if you go to any bookstore and look at the books, you don't even need to read much. Just look at the cover, and you will find out who the bestsellers are and what kind of stories they're actually selling. That's mainly and predominantly something that is we're going to be discussing later on when we start talking about prose. Books that are being read without much effort. So those are the readerly uh, kind of books oriented towards the reader. Okay, so as it goes, we're not going to make it easy for ourselves, and we're going to actually look into very difficult examples of literature that really isn't everyone's cup of tea. Um, of course, as mentioned yesterday, our focus in the studies will be on the producers, the receivers, and the manner of communication, or the discourse. You've probably heard the word discourse. This is what happens, how something communicates, not necessarily verbally, but just how certain aspects of a particular concept affect something else. So discourse is about causes and effects. Uh, Literature used to be a sort of understanding of being literate, so being able to read. And as we noticed yesterday, books became a medium that is a way to transmit or the way to communicate anything only at the point when there was a Gutenberg press around, and the books could be actually distributed in higher volumes. So many books could be produced and distributed at a price that wasn't too high. That also, it's a sort of a circle. So you get more books and more people get to be literate in order to be able to read more books. And it sort of actually influenced, along with other things, the change of the dominant genre from poetry to prose, poetry and drama to prose. Um, we mentioned yesterday, but we'll probably stop here and discuss it a bit, that literature as we see it should be a text that is primarily written down, printed, and finalized in some way, which is also assumed to be artistic or aesthetic. So, artistic, produced as a work of art. Um, Work of art is assumed also to be an original. And if you compare it to, for example, uh, visual arts or paintings, uh, there will be a certain difference between what we assume literature to be in terms of art and what is assumed in terms of originality of the work of art in terms of artifact or a painting. So literature is in line with being more like information than an object, and therefore the aspects of originality or assuming the lineage doesn't work for literature as much as it does for well products or artifacts related to the sculpture and painting and architecture and other aspects of art. So it's going to be different in the approach. Uh, but also the it involves an aesthetic element, and we talked about it yesterday. Aesthetic would be pleasing to the senses, or actually awakening the senses, not necessarily in a pleasant way, but just how working its way to affect our senses. And that goes for the art, especially contemporary and 20th century art, that they are not exactly looking for a pleasure effect in what they produce. Sometimes it's a provocation, sometimes it is actually in being unpleasant that something is established as a work of art. It should be creative or imaginative by all means, and it is a fictional, not a factual story. We'll go back to that in a second. It is produced by an author. Sometimes it is actually produced by a collection of authors. Sometimes you can't pinpoint the author. We didn't have the time to discuss the Bible yesterday, but it is also a question: is it literature? It's a collection of stories. It has religious use and value, but it is also a collection of stories by very different authors across a span of a lot of time, and not even. There are different kinds of Bibles actually recognized by different fractions, if you wish, by Christendom, and also there is a Hebrew Bible. And then do these all these compare, and which books, which stories are included in which versions of Bibles, and then how are those translated into languages, uh, or how the text of the Bible became a text in a single language in the first place, and then what happened to it later on. So it's a very complex story, and of course, Bible is in some sense also a part of literary history, but it complicates all of these issues that are listed here, what we take as literature. Literature, work of art, or commercial literature is always produced for an audience and with a reader in mind. And therefore, the process of communication that we are going to talk about in the next weeks is structured around this who speaks for the author, because the author and the audience never communicate directly, and how that voice is established in the work of fiction. And of course, we assume that literature is verbal in nature, that is, it uses predominantly words, language, not so much images, although we do have genres which deploy images in the same volume as words, like um, comic novel, oh, sorry, graphic novels that rely on comic book or cartoonish drawings or images. And we're supposed to, sorry, we're supposed to discuss something being fictional. Um, could anyone tell me what that? How do you understand fictional? What
Maybe
does it
like
mean?
something otherworldly, or just something that's not really likely to occur in real life.
Well, not necessarily. It can be just anything that isn't based on real events and people. Anything made
Okay,
up. It doesn't have to be supernatural.
true. So if something is fictional, it means that it actually can be based on real people. Sometimes even it is, but it's not about real people. It is about imaginary people who resemble the real people, or and events, or it could be about quite fantastic places and creatures, but it doesn't need to be. So the level of realism, how it compares to the real world, doesn't affect level of fictionality. That means all of the characters are just characters, they're not people. Whether or not their world or their fictional world or the world they inhabit is similar to the one we recognize as reality, or if it is quite different from it. So fictional means not actual. So you don't go to I don't know, archives, historical archives, and draw documents and write a story about that particular person. But you invent a character who resembles perhaps that particular person and is or gets involved in events that might be similar to the events that actual person was involved with. If you've probably all read Seobe, Czernianski Seobe, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the character of Vuki Sakovic is actually based on the actual person, but the story is not about that actual person. He's just used the events and the setting that exists in an archive in Vienna to produce the fictional story. So that's the level of imaginary that has to be present in literature. Otherwise, it would be either biography or historical document. Okay. We need to make a digression here. I know this is always something that puts you off, so please don't just give up. You've probably done a lot of this in the introduction to the studies of language, and I hope you know who Roman Jakobson is. Does anyone remember? Yes.
A famous linguist.
Okay. Yes, that's the one. We're just going to sort of mention him. What do you know about him?
I think that he's one of the first people who gave the definition of linguistics. I think that's
Okay.
the case.
Well, he was also Russian structuralist who had to flee Soviet Union, uh, along with a lot of progressive and well, avant-garde people from the art circles, and he moved to the Czechoslovakia, and there he started a school of linguistics. That's true, but he's a Russian guy, and he sort of belongs to the 1920s circles of Soviet Union's really advanced artists and well, I don't know if we could call them scientists, but I suspect they turned out to be, and very relevant critics like Mikhail Bakhtin, and most of them actually were suppressed, or their work was not as well known in the West until 1960s. That Jakobson is not one of those, but most of the others were sort of struggling because they had to either escape Stalin's claws or, well, somehow were not allowed to practice what they were doing. So, if anyone read Daniel Harms, is a writer, and if you know constructivists, they are artists and architects, and most of them had to run away. So, we're going to look into models of communication that actually rely on functions of language. And here, this is sort of stating the obvious how the process or how the model of the process of communication in any case is imagined or established. So the transmission of messages is the point of communication. Where the message is or where the meaning is hidden is something that might differ depending on the model. A message can be also form and context, not just content. Um, And channels can be something that actually allows the transfer. So a medium like a book, printed book, is the channel, the medium through which the message is sent to reach people. If you're on the phone, then your medium is quite different, right? And if you're sending telegraphs, then your medium is even different. If you're sending smoke signals, the medium is different. So the channel is related to how you do it. Common code is something that addresser and addressee need to share, and that's not just about the language, but rather the system of rules. So if you're sending smoke signals, there is no language that you share, but you would know which kind of cloud means what. And I can't send smoke signals, but that's the idea. Imagine if we take it out of the verbal, we could imagine street lights, semaphore. So to know actually what the red, yellow, and green means is to understand the code. Being educated, it's not natural, it's something that we learn. So that goes for the systems or the forms of the transfer of messages in literature as well. And here is the complex scheme of what goes around. So there is the communication that goes horizontally from the author to the reader with involving a literary text which is seen as a message, but that literary text is also encoded. It is structured in a particular manner so that the reader might be able to um, figure out what it is. So you know what a detective genre is because there are certain elements present, for example. It is also transferred through a medium which is currently either printed or electronic book, for example, or it could be an audiobook, and then it's a quite different medium. And there are institutions involved in the production and distribution and, well, dissemination of literature, from publishing houses, libraries to schools and, bookstores. And of course, there is this context that is also part of the message, which is aesthetically mediated reference to reality. So it's a sort of reality that we're talking about that we might be able to recognize, but it is also something that is filtered out in a manner that it doesn't look like when you're reading papers or when you walk out in the street. It's a bit different. And of course, there is this historical and context, which could be contemporary or it could be distant in time. So, this is the way that the author and the reader actually can get in touch. They never get in touch directly. So, this is all through something else, therefore, quite mediated. If we understand the code, or if we don't understand the code, depends on how we will be or not be able to understand the message, or how we will interpret or establish the meaning. Finnegan's Wake is a novel by James Joyce. Has anyone seen it, or do you know anything about it? No? Okay, if I click it, I will probably not be able to share it, but let's see if I can do. Let me see what. Oh, I am sharing it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, great. So this is an experimental kind of fiction. It doesn't really correspond linguistically to what you expect, even in the title. Do you know what a wake is? It's an Irish tradition when someone dies. Yes? Anyone? No?
Окончание.
I didn't really get that, but okay. It could be, everything is open for interpretation here. And this is a version which is sort of annotated because it makes it probably easier to find your way through it. but you will notice that it does not correspond to the rules of punctuation. It starts with not with a capital letter, and it doesn't actually correspond to any syntax or spelling that you would expect it. It's really, really difficult to understand anything. It most of it is open for interpretation, and that's what they did. Every underlined word actually has a footnote that explains what the reader, in this case, the creator of this website, imagined this should be or this could be. So this is an example where the code is not transparent. It is something that the author either experimented with or deliberately made opaque, so we can't make our way through it. If you look at Jabberwocky, and I think you know that poem, Lewis Carroll. Okay, we're sharing that now. Can you see it? "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves, the gyre and gimble and the wob. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrub." So this is a bit less difficult to to structure because we can recognize what?
I'm not sure about the others, but it's blurry for me, so I can't really.
Blurry. Okay, let me
Možda
try.
nije osnovno.
Can you zoom in a little bit? I think that's why it's blurry for me too.
I will try to fit it better. Let's say resolution. How about now?
For me, it's okay
It's
now.
good now.
Okay, so here
Možete samo
we.
pitanje ponoviti.
Did you make anything from this, from Finnegan's Wake? Jeste malo uspeli
Nope.
pročitati nešto? Jel možete sad?
Ne, sad
Sve
da,
presi.
sad da.
Ajde da probamo ovako. Jel možda bolje?
Odlično.
Da, bilo je okej malo pre.
Okay,
Mislim, sada je
so
dobro.
this is like a sentence, and we know it's a sentence because there is a full stop at the end of it. And it looks like it misses a page because it sort of starts off with in the middle of it, and you can't really tell which is which, or the syntax is wrong as well. So you can tell which part of speech each of the words could belong to, but the syntax is not really, the order of the words is not really understandable. And here, ovo znate, izvoli se u zemlji čuda. Jabberwocky. Here we have the sentence structure kept, but the semantics or the lexical choices are imaginary words. So this is the code that we don't share, but we understand what we don't share. And then if we move on, there will be some words that we will be able to pick up on. So it sort of creates an effect, but it doesn't confuse us. Finnegan's Wake is completely non-transparent. So both of these texts are constructed like so with a purpose. It is something that challenges the reader and deliberately breaks the convention. It's not that they didn't know any better. Okay, so what are the special cases of linguistic communication as a literary mode? And that means that this communication between the author and the reader sort of exists under special circumstances. We know that there will be not a direct contact between the two. that is time lag. It could be longer, it could be shorter, but it will always be something that someone wrote and then sent over, and then, time passed, and then you got to read it as a reader. And this particular text is the medium and the only link between the two people in conversation, or the two sides in conversation. And there could be no feedback from the addressee. And you probably learned something about it so far. I don't know how it works in your speaking exercises, uh, but to look for, and that's why this way of teaching is also very difficult. I don't get to see your faces, so I don't have any feedback from you. That happens to the writers as well, so they have to pack their message and just hope for the best, and hope that the addressee would actually share the code and understand, because there are no fixings, or as you go, there is no way to fix it. That's why literature relies on form, that is genre of communication, which is a collection of features which sort of establishes this communication within the domain of the expected and the known. So the reader already knows what to expect and how the conventions work. Therefore, it makes it easier. Um, as the Finnegan's Wake actually does the opposite. It works against those conventions and sort of dissolves the message, and it makes it impossible to read. So to sum it up, you have it here. The author produces a literary text, which is the medium and the channel with which the message reaches the recipient. The addressee, in order to understand the text, must share the common language and the conventions of the construction of the message, which is the genre and the general code, with the addressor. And literary texts incorporate references to historical or contemporary reality. So that would be the context. But these references are not direct. So it's not about people, but they're actually about characters who are based, or who have or share some features with the real people, but usually are composites, or they are not direct references. And you have the list of examples. Most of them are from popular and well-known examples. I don't know if have you seen any of this? Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Poldark, Sherlock Holmes.
Oh yeah, Game of Thrones. Yes.
Sherlock Holmes, yes.
Okay. Game of Thrones? No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So you could probably see that Game of Thrones would be imaginary, historically distant place, while, for example, Poldark would be 18th to 19th century Britain, so historical drama, but with realistic features. There would be the difference. The Expanse is a sci-fi show, but also shares references to our own reality. And Sherlock Holmes, of course, belongs to different periods, or you have versions of Sherlock Holmes, which place him in different cultural and historical settings. All right. So this is what happens when you read. You construct and sort of jumps out of the pages to scare you. And as a part of symbolic and social system, literature actually functions as a network of relations of the broader scope. So it's not just between the author and the reader, but an entire social sphere is included in it, and it all influences the communication. And now we go to our Jacobson. So the roles within the literary system relied on production, mediation, reception, and processing. And we talked about yesterday about who is involved in the production, who is involved in mediation, and how reception operates. Also processing, the criticism we did not mention, but criticism is something that assigns the value to the current literary works, or sort of reduces the value of it, or allows us to create sort of a construct of, or network of valuable works that would constitute our own canons. All right. But the approach that we are going to use is going to be textual analysis, and we're looking to issues that actually explain literature as a symbolic system. Literary texts also, in their interpretation, rely on theories, methods, and models of textual analysis. And the fields of study, or the ways to approach literature, can be also through literary histories, and those are usually national histories. So this literatures in plural in English, or Anglofona kniževnost, means British, Irish, American, Canadian, South African, Australian, Indian, and so on. Anything that is written in English. It could be then developed into a history, which would be observed in a linear manner according to the date of production, basically, and cross-referenced with the historical events of the time. It could be the study of authors' biographies. It could be the study of book trade, of media, of censorship, of what was going on, which political events influenced which productions of literary works. And of course, audiences and critical reception is also the way to study literature. How do we determine literary against non-literary? Is actually something that requires a reliable criteria. We're not looking for the essence of literature. Let's say there is no such thing that we can actually establish as true or as palpable. So we are going to look into the actual central criteria. Sorry, lost my headset. Okay. We're going to look into two criteria to establish what is literature and what is not: the position with respect to reality, and the position with respect to lack of factual value. So somehow literature does not claim to represent fact. And to illustrate that, here we have two things that are both guides. The first is Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it might be structured according to the rules of the actual guides, but it is, of course, a fictional. It's a story. And the other one that is called the guide is the actual guide that you can use in that could be useful in reality, that contains facts of actual value that correspond to the real world. Well, when you go to Vietnam and Angkor Wat, this could be a useful book. Douglas Adams and his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is probably completely useless if you wish to, well, you can't wish to travel the galaxy, but if you wish to examine galaxy. Two different concepts are involved in the creation of literature, and that is also something that goes back to Aristotle. Mimesis stands for, can you tell me?
Well, we learned in art class in high school that it's subjective representation of objective reality, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, but that, yes?
That's how I remember it. That's an art, but I'm not sure if
okay. So
if
this is interpretation of objective reality, which is subjective. But mimesis is basically copying. That's the idea, copying the reality that already exists. So whether or not it is subjective interpretation of it or not, but it's still open, but it is something that actually takes what is there and replicates it. And if anyone remembers Plato and the cave and these shadows on the wall of the cave, that would be mimesis. So somehow something that replicates the event. Mimesis is also considered to be the main the main process in creating theater. So replicating real events as if they are unfolding in front of our eyes. And it is here contrasted with poiesis, which is Aristotle's idea of creating from completely new, not copying from the existing real world, but inventing or the making of the new. But the principle of recreation the scenes in front of people's eyes, as if in theater, is also contrasted with telling about it, which is called diegesis, which will become important. So mimesis as a principle exists in art, exists in different aspects of artistic creation, and therefore can mean a lot of things. And it is here seen as an interplay between the text and the reality. Literature creates models of reality, and it uses specifically literary tools. And it sort of does not, we will not focus, or the issue should not be the relationship with reality, but how those literary texts actually represent, as you said, subjective interpretation of what is out there, how they transform this knowledge and experiences and the values and the norms that existed at the time of their creation, and how they presented themselves. So it's a sort of a filter. Literature is a filter for what goes on around us, as is any other form of art. So literature is cultural, not literal representation of reality. And that might seem a bit abstract now, but when you approach characters, they are characters on paper and they exist as far as that paper extends. So they did not have existences that would require or that would involve them in anything that is not in the book already. So also regarding the culture, it is not related to what was true that we can prove about particular culture at a particular time, but what could be true about a particular culture at a particular time. So it's just a plausibility issue, not not the relationship to the reality issue. Truthfulness means being documented. As we discussed our Hamlet yesterday, we said that there are 3 versions of the original Hamlet, but actually that relies on what is being preserved or that we know of. So the truthfulness has to relate to what is there that we know of. It can't go beyond that. Fictionality can have a relationship with what could be possible, or so any plausible, although unprovable, version of reality belongs to fictional domain. So it is fabricated and imaginative worlds presented in literary text. It could be very realistic as well. If you look at 19th century novels, all of them are quite realistic representation of imaginary places. And to illustrate that, this is a Gainsborough portrait of a landowner and his wife. And of course, they did not sit in the field to be portrayed, but the imagery or the scenery behind them is completely fictional and is there to represent them as people who own land. So the land is there as a sort of a notion, general notion, not their own land. Fictionality is related to the set of rules or social conventions, how we approach a certain text. So we know through that set of rules that something is going to be a Bildungsroman or a fairy tale or a sci-fi novel. And aesthetic criteria are something through which we evaluate the literary text. In accepting the fictional world that is within the work of literature, we exercise something that Coleridge, that's the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you probably mentioned it before or mentioned him before. He was also a philosopher. So he was one of the first people who actually defined how we accept the limitations of truthfulness of a fictional world. And he called it the suspension of disbelief. So we know that what we read about is not true in the sense that the world around us is true, but we sort of decide ourselves to believe in whatever goes on within those fictional universes. And we put on hold our knowledge about physics, for example, or possible events around us, and we believe in fantastic and imaginary events and creatures within the fictional universe. But that, of course, doesn't have to relate only to the fantastic and the supernatural, but that would be the most obvious example of. All right. Also, what is important to consider when literary texts are involved is the ambiguity or the quality of literature to allow for many interpretations. So it's not a math problem which has only one solution, and that's a correct one. While all the others are incorrect. Here we have a multitude of possible interpretations and understandings and potential meanings. Sometimes even with time, probably those that nobody could imagine at the point of creation. And it is also arising from our freedom to negotiate the meaning. So the message that the work of literature sends is actually something that we negotiate each time we read. It is not contained inside the text itself. Literature can also be observed as academic discourse, and that takes us beyond just reading or just reading for pleasure or just paying attention to authors and readers. It also shifts the focus towards theories and towards context and introduces something that is academic discourse, conventions of communication within the academic system, and a particular or specific scholarly meta language. That would probably become very relevant in your third and fourth year, and maybe even in the master studies when you start writing papers of your own. But just bear in mind, academic discourse on literature is very different from, let's say, reviews that you can read as sort of evaluations of literary works in terms of presenting them. So to illustrate that, if you click, we won't do it now, but you could do it yourselves. What a literary review looks like in The Guardian, for example, for the novel Atonement, and what a literary interpretation or this systematic analysis looks like and is related to the same. novel. Okay, so this is what is involved in all that, but this is just for reference, and how we achieve literary interpretations requires a lot more volume, so a lot more words or a lot more paper, and it also involves a different approach or a structuring of the writing in a particular way. How do we understand or interpret the text depends on what our language skills are, how the reader's worldviews are taken into account, what the linguistic meaning of the text is, what concrete meanings we can attribute, and in which context it all operates. Of course, what can be included is also issues about the author, political, cultural, socioeconomic, ideological contexts, intertextuality, references to other texts and genres, reception at the time of creation and later on. What else is there with works that this particular work is similar with? How is it different and how it stands out, and so on and so forth. What can be part of the rational discourse about textual features? Usually it is the content, what it is about. How is the language, or what are the linguistic features of it? What is the manner of story construction, so formal features of it, which are usually related to the fact who speaks, and if the narrative is organized in a particular way, and what are the effects of all that. So to examine genre, we should know that it comes from Latin, which means a sort of a group that is similar based on characteristics or features that we choose, and those features establish conventions and sort of a starting point or a sort of a frame into which the content is being loaded, if you wish, uploaded. In external form, it could be different in length. For example, we know that a poem is a poem because it's usually short. It could be established in verse, and we'll talk next week what verse actually is. When you look at it, that is where external form is exhibited, and which medium it is. Is it a film? Is it a radio drama? Is it performance stage, or is it just a book? And how the thematic criteria establishes the genre. When you go to the bookshop, how do you know where to look? So it could be alphabetical ordering of authors, but it also could say mystery or romance or something that would actually tell you what the major plot is about or what the story is about. And then finally, when you start reading, you will notice stylistic and textual aspects. And of course, we mentioned yesterday, and you know that from before, that the mega genres or three main genres or three main groups would be lyric, dramatic, and narrative. Essay and intersection of fiction and nonfiction of different kind usually is not readily accepted into literary works. And here we have an overview or a touch upon the literary models, methods, and terminology. I don't know how much of theory you've encountered so far, but theories in the humanities, it's not actually something that would be a closed system like in other sciences, like in physics or in mathematics, but it's a matter of establishing a map, so knowing how to work your way around things rather than actually making all the loose ends or catching all the loose ends. And it's a process where you actually have to discover a lot, explore, and you just start from a set of basic presuppositions. So we consider who's the author or what is the role of the reader, and then work from there in the concrete readings of literary texts. Theory is something that is an abstract system of categories that is used to explain or describe, usually describe the subject matter, while model is something that is reduced actually focuses or presents a thing with limited number of features that are relevant to that particular inquiry. A model cannot be all uh, embracing. It can't show everything. It probably is built just as to point out the most prominent or most important features for that particular purpose. While method is a procedure, so how we do something. So there would be rules on how we read, how we approach something, and what we focus on, and what we don't do. So what we won't do when you start analyzing your novel excerpts, we will not be retelling the content. That's not going to happen. So the focus of your papers, and you're supposed to produce papers, like a short essay, would be to read the section of the text without actually ever retelling what goes on. So event is not going to be retold. We need to focus on something else. And what we need to focus on will actually establish the method when we get there. So theory is basically an abstraction which questions how we do things, establishes basic principles and foundations, and approaches after they're really becoming concrete, or when you deploy them in a concrete situation, they become methods, ways of reading. They are concrete and practical, and they test our theories. They test the validity of our theory. Close reading is one of the methods that we will be using, and that is paying attention to textual details. So paying attention to the details that exist in the text. It's a technique of literary analysis that was invented, or sort of defined rather than invented, in a movement that basically dealt with poetry and new criticism and practical criticism, as it was called in Britain. And they were actually focused on poetry, and therefore devised a method of reading that would be dedicated to the textual features. Text communicates and has a message that reader needs to understand. Those are the assumptions. That could actually be developed into different ways to do that, and different processes of negotiation, which are then based on the nature of textuality and the communication process itself. So this is kind of abstract, but the theoretical approaches are actually something that answers questions, and those questions can be either basic, um, the questions of how something is put together, the question of poetics. Why is it pleasing, or why the effect of it is pleasing to the senses? That would be the aesthetic question, this literary communication. Or those questions could be very complex. So those basic ones would be related more to the actual textual material in front of us, while the complex questions relate to politics and ethics, and they're usually about um, other things rather than the text itself. So the context, the purpose and function of literature in the world generally, but also about the influences and forces that affected the creation and the placement of the literary work. Literary history, or the history of literary theory, reaches as far as Aristotle, but can be traced, as you can see here in the historical overview, depending on the dominant influences from Aristotle to biblical exegesis and to Renaissance and Neoclassicism, which then again sort of re-invoked Aristotle and traditions of ancient Greek and Roman literature, to the early psychological approaches, Freudian psychoanalysis, which influenced formalism and new criticism. And then we've got philosophical approaches, phenomenology, Marxism, structuralism, post-structuralism, and then from the 1960s, postmodernist feminism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and deconstruction, and so forth, and so on and so forth, up to post-colonial studies, queer theory, and eco-criticism. All of these approaches are theoretical approaches that you can use not only in literature, but on other aspects of or on different texts and other aspects of cultural production too. And also on other media. One of the important things that we mentioned yesterday is that we can make a sort of a typological overview on of theories, and that is in your workbook, page 3, I think. So whether they're author-oriented, text-oriented, context-oriented, or reader-oriented, that will become important in your later years. For this particular course, we will be using structuralist and somewhat post-structuralist analysis, which is predominantly text-oriented. Okay, I think I lost something, so I'll try to find it. And I think I skipped something. I'm not sure. Do you have any questions regarding this? You will not be required to actually reproduce any of this. Yes, how come? Oh, I see. I need to go back a little because something happened and my slides got hidden. You will be required to actually just be able to answer the question what poetics is and what is the place of literature according to you and to what we discussed here of literature in the sort of general system of cultural production. That you can do with the help of your book as well. So if you need more information or if this appears to be blurry and well, less clear than you'd like, then we can also have an additional session to discuss it. All right, so something just stole my slides away. And here we can go back to Roman Jakobson quickly to go through the questions, the conventions, function of language, and can you see that? Probably yes. Okay, good. Why is this so important? It's a link between language studies, which is also something that is very important because literature is the art of language. So it actually uses the language to create its own effects And it is good to actually be aware of the factors that participate in this process, and that literature is also a version of linguistic communication. 6 functions of language is something that is linked to Jacobson's philosophy of language, but to structuralism as well, which basically tells us that we can focus differently our messages in order to achieve a particular effect. And emotional or emotive function would be usually focused towards how the speaker feels, or focused on the speaker's aspect of expression. Conative would be focused on the addressee. So you really ought to study harder, which again is not only focused on the addressee, but is establishing a direct address by using the pronoun for the second person. So this is direct address. Be aware of the conative function when you write, because sometimes slipping into using second person seems natural, but that also establishes a completely different focus of your writing. So it's a good thing to know about it. Referential function is actually related to the truth value of the information. And as we said in literary texts, it is somehow toned down or eclipsed because we are more interested in the internal features of the text or formal features of the text rather than the truth value of the text. We're not interested in truth value at all. So in the aesthetic effect comes before referential function in literature. This is an interesting thing that is probably relevant for any kind of communication, as phatic function, which tells us that there are kinds of communication which transfer no messages other than establishing that the channel is open. That is best seen if you, for example, say hello to your neighbor in the elevator and even engage in small talk. It doesn't really mean anything, right? When you say hello, when you meet a person or you just pass by someone who you know, you just say hello. There is no message in it. But what would happen if you didn't say hello and you just walked past someone you knew?
We would seem impolite.
Or they would think there's something wrong. So by saying hello, you're saying our channel is open, we're good. And here we have, Peanuts, Snoopy, cartoon, a conversation between Leon and Charlie Brown. I was just trying to talk with that little girl up the street, but I couldn't say a word. I just stood there, all embarrassed and confused. I got so self-conscious, I didn't know what to do. So he was trying to talk to the girl, but he couldn't. So I hit her. So he established a sort of a channel of communication, so a kind of a link. Not really a fortunate one, but this is like saying hello, also hitting someone or pulling their hair just to establish contact. And that is the phatic function in communication. And of course, what we will be most interested in is the poetic function of language, which is basically answering the question, why does this language work as verbal art? What is the poetic function, or how is this effect established through the poetic function? Jacobson's idea and the structuralist development of it is actually that the language in poetic function operates using two axes of selection and axes of combination. So how it operates, I try to draw a sort of a jigsaw, if you wish. So we know that axis of combination is determined by syntax. And each language has the syntax of its own, and it tells us which is the normal or the acceptable word order. So this is a part of our code. And that means that you start your sentences with a capital letter and that you end it with a punctuation mark, which is accordingly according to the meaning of the message, the one that you choose. And in English, subject, verb, object is the common order of word order in the sentence. And I suspect you know the Chomsky sentence about green ideas sleeping furiously.
Yes.
Do you know that?
Yes.
You know that. Basically, that makes no sense, but it works as syntax. This is a similar thing. So we have a determiner, and we know that a determiner needs to be followed by a subject, which is usually a noun, and then comes the verb. But to say a woman cries, you actually have a selection, or you can rotate those choices to line up a sentence that would have a poetic function and that would create this aesthetic effect. So you could say a lady weeps or a lass whines or something like that, and it creates different effects. But it basically means a woman cries. Just by choosing the semantic nuance, we are actually producing this aesthetic effect. It is quite obvious when you look at it, but at the time it was somewhat revolutionary. So axis of selection and axis of combination are the tools that actually create or participate in the poetic function of language and create the aesthetic effect. To illustrate that, you know Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe and the choices that are there, and we will probably go back to the choices next week when we discuss poetry and verse and rhyme. And that's it. I think we just got caught up with it. All right, how's the time? Oh, just about. So so far, do you have any questions, comments? I
Profesor,
know.
imam ja jedno pitanje.
Kažite.
Izvinite, možete vi završiti pa ću ja onda pitati.
Ne, ništa, ja nisam htjela ništa, samo sam htjela kažem da je možda sada ovo dosta zahtjevno zato što pretpostavlja da bi trebalo da povezujete neke stvari koje možda još niste savladali, ali dakle ovo je čisto uvodni deo koji zapravo i neće biti nešto gde vi treba da pokažete da ste savladali, nego je zapravo najava u što će se sve ovo pretvoriti do kraja semestra, nadam se. Kažite.
Da, pa vezano za to je bilo moje pitanje, da li onda, na primer, sada to gradivo, ali sad sam razumela šta ste htjeli da kažete, da li to, na primer, ulazi u taj prvi deo koji ćemo negde, kako bih rekla, reprodukovati i ocenjivati, bit će ocenjeno na kolokvijumu, ili je to, mislim, evo sad sam shvatila da je to generalno neki
To je
uvod
generalna
u
ilustracija.
tako da.
To je generalna ilustracija pristupa književnosti. Dakle, da razumete da tu ima dosta onoga što je vezano za način pristupa jeziku, odnosno razumevanje jezika. Dosta toga će biti i sa drugih strana, dakle, kako ćemo mi to sve raditi. Ono što bi trebalo da savladate i što ću ja očekivati da ste vi savladali je da znate koje su, na koji način se tipološki razvrstavaju teorije, dakle koje bi bile text oriented, a koje ne bi. To je ono što imate u skripti. Naravno, ne morate ih učiti sve, one koje budemo pominjali dok budemo radili poeziju i dramu će vam biti važne, pa ćete već shvatiti šta se očekuje, ali dakle trebalo bi da znate da je ono čime se mi bavimo strukturalistički pristup ili poststrukturalistički pristup, trebalo bi da znate periodizacije, dakle da povežete kontekst, naročito za poeziju i dramu je to važno, a kasnije će se pojaviti i u trećoj nedelji kad budemo razgovarali o upotrebi onoga što je figurative language, kako se zapravo pristup tome i definicija toga šta je to figurative language menjalo vremenom. Pa je onda tu važno da razumete i malo filozofije jezika i zašto se zapravo poezija razvijala na takav način. Dakle, kako smo od Šekspira stigli do romantizma i šta se tu događalo sa samim shvatanjem jezika i uopšte ljudskog intelekta, if you wish. Dakle, neće biti ovo sve da treba da učite, ali ovo jeste nešto što je ukupno prikaz pristupa šta ćemo sve raditi. Imate li još pitanja? Vidjet ćete, to postaće možda malo jasnije kad se malo odmakne i kad se zapravo pozabavimo nekim konkretnim stvarima, kada ovo dobije neku materializaciju, ali ne može sve odjednom. Sad moja najava za sledeću nedelju. Za sledeću nedelju će vam trebati nekoliko narednih strana iz skripta, reći ću vam tačno kojih. Bavimo se onim što su sound effects of poetry, dakle bavimo se ritmom, stihom od anglosaksonske poezije do tamo vidjet ćemo dokle, do romantizma, verovatno ćemo tu stati i tu ćete dobiti nekakav opet preview šta ćemo sve raditi. Ja pretpostavljam da ste vi već radili anglosaksonski stih, da?
Jesmo, spominjali smo na
Pominjali smo.
VK1.
Dobro. Sad ćemo malo to razrađivati, odnosno gledat ćemo na koje načine se materializuje. Dakle, šta to zapravo znači accentual verse i kako se došlo do toga da šta je razlika između accentual i metric i tako dalje. Dakle, bavit ćemo se tim nekakvim osobenostima. Sad, tu će biti nešto malo onoga što ste već pomenuli nekad, verovatno Petrark, koja se sećamo iz škole, nadam se, soneta i takvih stvari, vidjet ćete to će biti ponavljanje, ali više ćemo se baviti, odnosno uglavnom